Welcome to another episode of This Is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast. Your safe space to discuss sports, politics, social issues, and even religion. Where we will take it all very seriously, but not too seriously. Although there have been a number of hot takes about the Kyle Rittenhouse trial, no matter where you fall on his guilt or innocence, no matter where you fall on the political spectrum, the kid gave us a great lesson in civics. And that lesson, how to communicate to the police when you are in custody, when you have been accused of or are suspected of a crime. And the Chicago Blackhawks sex scandal. I did not want to cover this piece. I truly did not. In fact, I had a whole piece laid out and much of it recorded about the New York Metropolitans and the buffoonery that is their GM search and eventual GM hire. Now, I know you're thinking, how much can you say about hiring a guy who's done nothing more in the league than spend a ton of money and win nothing? But I got a good 20 minutes out of it. More consistent with the theme, with the mission statement of this very podcast, I had to address the Chicago Blackhawks sex scandal. Once again, the very fandom that I've held so dear, that I've cherished for so long, is in question. Let's get it started in here.
Act 1. Kyle Rittenhouse got one thing right.
Kyle Rittenhouse is the kid who lives in Illinois, who took an AR-15 into Kenosha, Wisconsin, during the riots after the death of Jacob Blake. This is sad. I actually had to remember which guy got killed. There's been so many guys to get killed by the police. That was Jacob Blake. Okay, so after Jacob Blake was shot and killed by police, civil unrest, and this young man goes from Illinois into Wisconsin with an AR-15. As of this recording, the trial has concluded. The charges have been presented to the jury. The jury is out. The jury is deliberating. We'll see whether or not he's found guilty and to what extent he's found guilty for any of the charges. I believe, and I'm actually confirming this right now, yes, the jury has asked that they be allowed to consider lesser charges as well as the charges that were presented by the district attorney. I only want to make one comment to you, dear listener, and it's a very interesting phenomenon that occurred when this kid, and that's what he is, he's a 17-year-old kid, when this kid got arrested. You, dear listener, it is very unlikely that in the event that you are interviewed by the police and or arrested by the police, you will not do what Kyle Rittenhouse did. I have to repeat this because it is so important. It is very unlikely that in the event that you are interrogated, you are interviewed, you are arrested by the police, you will not do what that young man did. And it's very simple. Shut up. Shut your mouth. In an interview, that is simply a police officer asking you questions. In an interrogation where you have not been arrested, but by way of the tone of the questions being presented to you and often by way of the environment, you know that you are being questioned about possibly being involved in a crime. And third, and most important, when you've actually been placed under arrest, when you are in custody. Do you hear what I'm saying to you, dear listener? Shut your mouth. You do not answer any of the police questions. You do not volunteer information. You simply keep your mouth shut. Well, I grew up in a household where we always were told to respect police and cooperate. You're an idiot. And your parents are idiots. Well, I grew up in a community where we're a law-abiding community, and out there in the suburbs, out there in the puritanical suburban nightmare that is 21st century America, we were always told that your neighbors are idiots. Well, I'm very active in my church, and all the congregants there, we are a very law-abiding, we are a very respectful community of people. And we were always told, your parishioners, your congregants, your fellow churchgoers are idiots. Let's be clear, kids. Let's be clear about this country and why it was founded. A bunch of people came over here from England on boats. Then a bunch of people came from all over Europe on boats. And they settled the area. They settled the east coast of the United States. And they formed themselves some colonies. They had a working infrastructure of government. They had a loose and more often than not effective charter of cooperation between colonies. And things were going along swimmingly. Eventually, those colonists got pissed off at always being treated like second-class citizens by this guy called the King. And eventually, it came to a head with this guy called the King of England. And the King of England came forth with a bunch of edicts that said, if I want to kick in your door's getting kicked in. If I want to arrest you, you're getting arrested. Don't need a charge. Don't need any probable cause. And by the way, anything, and I mean anything, that you volunteer, well, that can be used against you. Civil unrest, what the British called an insurrection, what we called a revolutionary war. Decade later, have ourselves a little constitution, have ourselves a little Bill of Rights. This country is steeped in the foundation. As a citizen, you do not have to volunteer anything that will be used against you in a court of law. I found it strange, as did the judge, as did many a legal pundit, that after his arrest, after he was in custody, Kyle Rittenhouse refused to offer anything to the police. He remained silent. Folks, that's how you do it. Under any circumstance, as I have just said, an interview, an interrogation, once you are arrested and placed in custody, you do not volunteer anything. You do not cooperate. You do not offer anything to the police. This kid was 17 years old, and he did something that 95% of the population in this country just can't seem to do. People just can't help but feel like they can talk their way out of any situation, particularly one dealing with law enforcement. You aren't going to talk your way out of a situation with the police. In fact, and the reason why this standard exists, the police are going to use whatever you say against you. And they're not going to look at what you say in its totality, of course. They are going to take bits and pieces of what you volunteer, and they're going to use it against you. Nothing illustrates this more than the prosecutor in this case, in this Kyle Rittenhouse case, using not information that Rittenhouse volunteered, but the very fact that he remained silent, trying to use that against him in this case, prosecuting him for a crime. Are you truly listening to what I'm saying to you, dear listener? The prosecutor didn't use information volunteered after Rittenhouse had been placed into custody. The prosecutor attempted to use his silence against him. When you are arrested, when you were placed in custody, the police and the prosecution are going to use anything they can in order to convict you. But what about truth? What about justice? What have I told you in previous podcasts, dear listener? What have I said? You want truth, you want justice, go to church. Go to mosque. Go to synagogue. Go to the Buddhist temple. Go see your shaman. Courtrooms are not where you find truth and justice. Courtrooms are particular to criminal cases where prosecutors, where district attorneys keep score. It is binary. It's either a win or a loss. Prosecutors, district attorneys bring cases that they feel they can win. If they do not feel like they can win the case, they don't bring the case. Truth or justice be damned. It's about wins and losses. You are giving the police, you are giving a prosecutor opportunity. Reflect on the word. You are giving the police, you are giving the prosecutor opportunity to bring a charge against you by volunteering information in an interview, in an interrogation, or while you're in custody. You are creating this opportunity. You're almost creating this foundation, this platform for them to build a case against you. And here, this 17-year-old conducts himself in a manner that many of you can't seem to mirror. Okay, you're so smart. What do we do in the event that we get questioned by the police? What do we do in the event that we're placed into custody? First and foremost, under any circumstance, if you are being questioned by the police, under any circumstance, the first thing that you ask, did you hear what I just said? I didn't say you answer any of the questions that are being presented to you. I didn't say that you make any kind of statement. I said the first thing that you ask. The first thing that you ask is, do you consider me a suspect in a crime? Let's quickly recap. A police officer presents to you, whether that be in a parking lot, whether that be at your place of work, whether that be at your home, and begins asking you questions. You do not volunteer any information. You do not make statements. You simply ask, officer, do you consider me a suspect in a crime? That's all you say. That's all you say. Now, many of you, and rightfully so, will suspect that that officer will become combative, will become hostile, will begin to argue with you about the efficacy of whether or not the officer has to answer that question, that you look guilty in not answering any questions or not providing information. You remain calm. You, dear listener, remain calm. In the event the officer begins to escalate the situation, begins to create a confrontation, you remain calm and you simply ask again, do you consider me a suspect in a crime? And you throw in a caveat. That's right. You throw in a caveat. What is that caveat? Officer, if you can't answer this question, I interpret that as you admitting to me that I'm a suspect in a crime, and therefore I refuse to answer any questions. Lawyer. And you actually state as much. I refuse to answer any questions. Lawyer. In the situation where you were being interrogated by the police, now that may not be under arrest. You may not be what they call in custody. This is where officers confront people all the time. They're usually in a very hostile vibration. They present as perturbed. They present with raised voices, yelling at people. This is not customary for most of us. This is a situation where we feel like once we are being yelled at by an authority figure, we have to volunteer information. Again, remain calm, dear listener. Remain calm. You simply ask, do you consider me a suspect in a crime? Under any and all circumstances, this is your stock response. Well then, what do I say if I've already been arrested, if I've already been placed in custody? What if the cops just come and put me in cuffs? The only thing that you say, dear listener, in that circumstance is lawyer. You ask nothing of the police. You do not get into any kind of confrontation with the police. You just keep repeating to them, I want a lawyer. I want to talk to my lawyer. I want to see my lawyer. That's it. Another quick recap. You are questioned by the police. You just simply ask, am I a suspect in a crime? Whether that is simple questioning or whether that is what you would qualify as an interrogation. Beyond that, if you are in custody or you feel like you are getting a hostile response from a police officer, from a detective, to your question about whether or not they consider you a suspect in a crime, you simply say, I want to talk to my lawyer. I'm only going to communicate to you through my lawyer. 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 Kyle Rittenhouse did something that is quite remarkable in the 21st century. We have been conditioned that once we are approached by a police officer, under any circumstance, we're just supposed to volunteer information. That is in opposite to the very foundation of this country. That is in opposite to the very reason why we ended up rebelling against the king. Now, this may come off as I'm being anti-police, I'm being hostile to law enforcement. Nothing could be further from the truth. Let's be very clear about how the law operates now in the 21st century. Over the course of roughly the last 50 years, a number of decisions have come out from the U.S. Supreme Court about whether or not law enforcement could use lies, deceit, trickery to elicit confessions from suspects. Now, I'm not going to go over all of that case law. That's not why I'm bringing this to your attention. The fact of the matter is, numerous decisions have supported police officers, detectives, lying to suspects, tricking suspects so that they would make confessions, and those confessions were upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court. In other words, the police can very often lie to you in order to elicit a confession from you, and regardless of whether or not you were confessing to something that you actually did, that confession will be held lawful and can be used against you in a court of law. This is something that I've wanted to comment on for a long time, specific to this podcast. And so I'm going to briefly make this point here. This is not an indictment of police officers. Police officers, detectives, I don't think that they truly understand what these decisions have done to public trust in the police. But when you understand as a citizen that the police can lie to you and can do so with impunity so that they can elicit from you not just a confession, but incriminating evidence, you will volunteer things that can be used against you in a court of law, based on lies, based on trickery, based on misrepresentation. When the police can lie to you, it degrades public trust in the police. You can't be sure that when a police officer is interviewing you, is interrogating you, that they're telling you the truth. You have to assume that they're lying to you. Why do you have to assume that? Because they can lie to you. They can lie to you to elicit information, if not a confession, and that will be used against you regardless of whether or not it's an authentic confession, whether or not you actually committed the crime. So taking nothing away from the police, you as a private citizen, you have to protect yourself. You have to assume that the police are always lying to you, and it's easier in any interaction with the police for you to fall back to two simple statements. The first statement being, am I a suspect in a crime? And the second statement being, lawyer. Or, if you prefer to be loquacious, I want to talk to a lawyer. I want to talk to my lawyer. It's actually rare, in my experience, that a case of this magnitude, the Kyle Rittenhouse case, in a case of this magnitude, with someone so young as the accused, as the suspect, it is rare that that person would go into police custody and have the wherewithal not to say anything, to refuse to answer any questions of the police. And I wanted to note this to you, dear listener, because even under that paradigm, even under the paradigm of a fundamental right that you have not to volunteer information, to refuse to incriminate yourself, that is being used in this case by the prosecutor as an indictment of guilt, as knowledge of guilt. Rightfully, the judge called out the prosecutor for attempting to do this, for attempting to use Rittenhouse's silence as an indictment or an indication of his guilty mind. Take away the lesson here. Take away the lesson. The prosecutor is looking at this in a binary win or loss lens. The law, the rights of the individual citizen, the prosecutor doesn't give a damn, and very often the police don't give a damn. If they think that you're guilty, they'll do anything that they can to elicit a confession. They will do anything that they can to obtain a guilty verdict. Some of you may think that Kyle Rittenhouse is guilty. Some of you may think that he had a justification for doing what he did and therefore he is innocent. That's not the point of this segment at all. Don't, under any circumstance, volunteer any information to the police. You've got two things to say to the police. Am I a suspect in a crime? I want to talk to a lawyer. Never let it be said that you weren't able to learn something so valuable from a 17-year-old.
Act 2, the Chicago Blackhawks sex abuse scandal.
One of the primary reasons I started this podcast was to discuss my transformation, if you will, my evolution as a sports fan, my evolution as a sports consumer. In my youth, in my fledgling years, I spent not only a lot of time, but a lot of my money on sports-related activities, on memorabilia, on paraphernalia, on the swag. I spent money on tickets. I spent money on travel and travel accommodations to go to sporting events. One of the things that is most important about sports and sports fandom is the sense of community. It's striking how many people you will meet and how many different types of people you will meet through your fandom. And in that moment, when you're discussing Team A or Team B that you either really, really passionately follow or really, really passionately despise, all of those other layers, all of the labels, they fall away. In that moment, you have camaraderie with that other person. That is a very attractive quality to being a sports fan. But it is that sense of loyalty, it is that passion, it's the camaraderie that drives us not only to spend significant amounts of time, but significant amounts of money on these sports franchises. My growth, my evolution surrounds how these actors, these sports franchises, the athletes, the coaches, the general managers, the owners, the league itself, the league office, the league officials, how do these people conduct themselves in light of all of this power, the money that's generated, the attention that's generated? After reflection and upon careful examination, these people present as money-hungry assholes, often unqualified, power-drunk doofuses. The leagues, the teams, the general managers, the coaches, the players, and specifically their partners, the media outlets that are broadcasting these games, they will all generally circle the wagon in light of what is, very often, the tragedy of the way these organizations are managed. As I have expressed over and over again during the course of the time that I've been publishing this podcast, in a strange way, this reflection has been an advantage. I have spent less time, less energy focusing on the sports, focusing on the players, focusing on the coaches, the GMs, the owners. I have become increasingly less concerned about the product on the field, the outcome of different contests. Life is not complicated. You fuel the things that you like with your attention and with your money. And if you no longer like something, if you no longer approve of something, you are a fool to think you're going to change it by simply complaining if you still give it all of your attention, if you still give it all of your money, if you still give it all of your power. Although I have not talked much about it on this podcast, and there's a good reason, I am a very passionate hockey fan. I follow the Detroit Red Wings, the winged wheel, the powerful winged wheel. If you are familiar in any way, shape, or form with hockey, you are probably reflecting now on that comment and thinking to yourself, the winged wheel is not powerful, sir. No, it isn't. The Detroit Red Wings have been bad, and they've been bad for a number of seasons. This is not terribly disturbing to me because it's something that should have happened probably 5 to 8 years ago. The team had a dynasty, the team was powerful, the team's stars were aging, the GM, Ken Holland, hung on too long to the dream that the Red Wings were always going to be good and were always going to make the playoffs, and did not engage in the rebuild as he should have. He let it completely crumble and burn to the ground before he left and Steve Yzerman came in to bring back the power of the winged wheel. I state this only because I do follow the ins and outs of the National Hockey League and hockey in general. Accordingly, I have put off long enough commenting on the story with the Chicago Blackhawks. And curiously, after reviewing a number of the articles that have been published about the Chicago Blackhawks and reflecting on the media coverage or the lack thereof, it is another brick in that wall. It is another straw on the camel's back. Why am I so faithful in my dedication to these sports leagues, to these sports franchises, to the media partners, when they are such contemptible pricks? Some of you as sports fans may not be entirely aware of what I'm referring to. And if you are not a sports fan, this is the type of story that transcends sports and yet has very little national media coverage. To what am I referring, you may be asking, dear listener? In the year of our Lord, 2010, the Chicago Blackhawks were storming their way to a Stanley Cup. This was a team, this was a franchise that had been mediocre for decades. But mediocre no longer. Very good team, mix of youth, veterans. As a Detroit Red Wings fan, I was none too pleased to see the rise of the Blackhawk. As it turns out, many of the people within the franchise knew, including Joel Quenneville, the coach at the time, and a number of very key front office personnel. One of the coaching staff, a video editor or a video coach, as it were, one of these staff members was sexually harassing, if not using that position to solicit and obtain sexual favors from members of the Blackhawks team. This staff member threatened players within the Blackhawks system. So not players necessarily with the Blackhawks team itself, but also players within the minors. A quick aside for those that are not hockey fans or are not familiar with the way that hockey operates. Hockey is very similar to Major League Baseball, to the sport of baseball. How so? Major League Baseball players do not get drafted when they're 16, 17, 18 years old and then enter into the major leagues immediately. They are not ready for the big show. So there is a very well-developed minor league system so that they can begin to hone their skills and they can be brought up to the major league team. Hockey is no different. 16, 17, 18-year-olds are drafted, and very often they go into what are called the minors. Just like in baseball, they're not ready as a 16, 17, 18-year-old to begin playing in the National Hockey League. They have to hone their skills in order to be ready to go to the big show. So that it is clear for you, dear listener, this staff member of the Chicago Blackhawks, although it is alleged, and I believe it's pretty well conceded, that this staff member was soliciting members of the Blackhawks team, of the professional franchise, this staff member was also soliciting players in the minor leagues. These are younger players that are working their way up to the professional franchise. They are younger, they are more impressionable, and they are looking to please. They are looking to make their way to the professional franchise, to the Blackhawks. This was so well known within the organization, it was referred to as an open secret that this staff member had solicited players not only on the Blackhawks team, this Stanley Cup winning Blackhawks team, but also players within the minor leagues, using whatever leverage a video coach can have. Using that leverage, this staff member obtained sexual favors from players within the minor league. This information was actually discussed amongst the coaching staff and key members of the Blackhawks front office weeks before they actually played in the Stanley Cup in 2010. According to these reports, the decision was made not to do anything about it at that time because it would detract from the Stanley Cup run. After the season, after the Stanley Cup was actually won by the Blackhawks, this individual, Brad Aldrich, was let go by the Blackhawks. From the information that I have gleaned, he was not fired, he just was not retained by the Blackhawks. The season ended with the Blackhawks winning the Stanley Cup. He was not retained for the 2011 season. Now, we as professionals, as adults, we can add 2, and then we can add the other 2. We can come out with the sum total of 4, and we can see that based on these allegations that were being discussed prior to the Stanley Cup and the legitimacy of these allegations, it's very likely that the response to this gentleman making these overtures to people on the team and making threats, making demands of players in the minor league, Aldrich was not asked to stay on that team because of that conduct, and it was all very quietly dismissed. As is always the case with sexual predators, what happened when Aldrich went on to his next career stop? Did the conduct continue? Of course it did. And as you may have already surmised, dear listener, yes, Aldrich went on to sexually assault a minor. And naturally, there are lawsuits aplenty. In response, the Chicago Blackhawks, as these franchisers are wont to do, hire a law firm to do an internal investigation into what really happened. That investigation confirmed most of the basest allegations that yes, this person, Aldrich, he did in fact solicit players on the Blackhawks team for sexual favors, which appear to have been dismissed, but he also used leverage on players in the minors to actually obtain sexual favors. It is also clear from the investigation that yes, the coaching staff and front office personnel were made aware of this during the Stanley Cup run and decided not to address it until they had finished their playoff run, which, as history demonstrates, was successful. The Blackhawks did in fact win the Stanley Cup. After the season, it appears that the decision was made not to keep Aldrich, but to also keep all of this quiet. The silence allows Aldrich to go on to other stops in his career where he continues in the same behavior, where he sexually assaults a minor. How much media coverage have you seen surrounding this entire incident, dear listener? It's not much. For its part, the National Hockey League and its commissioner, Gary Bettman, decides to take action in light of the report, the internal investigation conducted by the Blackhawks, and he fines the team $2 million. $2 million, you may ask, dear listener. $2 million. That's a lot of money. Yes, it is a lot of money. But let's put it into perspective. Another fine recently levied by the NHL, recently levied by Gary Bettman, was to the New Jersey Devils. The New Jersey Devils had, in a not so clever attempt, circumvented the salary cap. As a penalty to the New Jersey Devils for doing as much, they were fined $3 million. Having a sexual predator on your staff, being aware of that sexual predator's proclivities, doing nothing about it, if not hiding that fact, and then allowing that person to leave the organization, commit additional crimes, that's a $2 million fine. Not complying with the salary cap, that's a $3 million fine. In his defense, when confronted with what is on its face a nonsensical discrepancy, Bettman, commissioner of the National Hockey League, argued that the league doesn't have a sexual misconduct policy. Therefore, the fine was commensurate to the facts of that individual case, and each case will be judged on its individual merits. I don't know how you feel about the optics, dear listener, but it's situations like these that reinforce my evolution, my growth away from the sport, from sport in general. These people, these commissioners, these team owners, very often front office staff, general managers, coaches, and sometimes, yes, even the players, these people are fucking buffoons. Tone-deaf buffoons. Many organizations have a masculine environment. Leadership is generally male. It is not specific to sports. There is an aggro and aggressive culture and aggressive environment, particularly when you get into the C-suite level of leadership, executive leadership. You hear it all the time. Type A personalities. Aggro environments led by men, a masculine, a male-dominated environment with type A personalities, I believe, often look at these types of situations with sexual predators as an indictment on their own judgment and their own masculinity. How could we have not seen that the sexual predator was a sexual predator? How are we to admit to others, to the community, that we had in our midst a sexual predator? What have I been communicating to you, dear listener, about my own spiritual journey? How much it is confronting and then resolving things that happen to you throughout the course of your life, and these emotions concerning these events in your life, namely what? Guilt, namely shame, whether it's the Catholic Church, whether it's Penn State University, whether it's some congressman or senator's staffing office, the common response to these types of situations is what? Silence. Why? Guilt and shame. Admitting that there is a sexual predator in your midst is what? It's an indictment upon you, upon your masculinity, upon your judgment. No thought whatsoever as to the right thing to do. It's what does this do to me? How does this reflect upon me, upon the organization that I work for? What kind of man am I? How does this reflect upon my masculinity that I have as part of my team, as part of my staff, as part of my organization? A sexual predator, a male that is preying on younger males. When you look at it from that perspective, silence makes sense. It's not the right thing to do, it's the easy thing to do. No organization is immune. And what's so interesting about this story with the Blackhawks, it isn't unique. We aren't hearing about something that so shocks our conscience because we haven't heard anything like this before. It is actually starting to become commonplace, and therefore we are getting accustomed to it. It's like a school shooting. We're getting desensitized. This nation was horrified in the wake of the Columbine shooting. Here we are, but a couple of decades later, and it's commonplace to the point where we don't even blink an eye. I don't have a solution to this type of problem, but for the solution that I've been employing personally in my life for at least the last 25 years. And that is to control your dollars, to control your attention, to control your energy. The test has been set for me. The Detroit Red Wings are actually a competent hockey team this season. They actually go out on the ice and score more goals than their opponents. It's been a number of years since I could say that. And yet, with all of the excitement that I feel for the rise of the winged wheel, what do I do in the wake of A, this type of scandal, and B, the league's response to as much? To me, it's spitting in the face of every single fan, basically saying to them, you don't give a damn, so we don't give a damn. This may make me unique, or may make you think, dear listener, that I'm strange. But I'm not down with the concealing of pedophiles. I don't find that acceptable. I'm not sure that there are particular facts or circumstances specific to incidents that make the covering up of sexual misconduct, of these types of sex assaults. I don't think that it's warranted. I certainly don't think that it's warranted such that you would have an incident where the front office and the coaching staff knew of something that was going on within their own team, decided to keep it secret, then just let the person, the perpetrator, the aggressor, just let them go, don't renew their contract, let them go out into the world and continue such nefarious conduct. I don't think that under those circumstances, only a $2 million fine is warranted when a team simply goes out in an attempt to get a competitive advantage, exceeds the salary cap, and tries to use clever accounting to get away with it. I don't see that that circumstance indeed warrants a higher fine than covering up the sexual misconduct. I want to ignore this. I want this to go away. I don't want this to be a part of what I have to wrestle with in order to simply watch a hockey game. But what I reflect upon is the fact that I didn't create this. And the only way that I can effectuate any change is, again, to withhold my attention and to withhold my dollars. The few of you who actually reach out to me and discuss with me the progress of any of my teams, namely the Detroit Red Wings, you may find that I am not as well versed as I should be on their current state of affairs, on the progress that they're making this season. The Red Wings were on National Hockey Night on ESPN, which appears on ESPN Plus, playing the Dallas Stars. I just couldn't watch it. And I'm not saying that I'm never going to be able to watch hockey again, but I'll say something that a lot of people have been saying for the last 10 years. Gary Bettman, the commissioner, he got to go. Just like the Detroit Red Wings keeping around a general manager for probably a decade too long, the NHL has kept around this commissioner for about a decade too long. Whoever thought that this spiritual journey that I engaged on would bring to me this conscience, right? I want the escapism just as much as you do, dear listener, but I can't overlook this kind of bullshit. This is Why I Don't Vote, a podcast.